There's a version of falling in love that looks nothing like the movies, nothing like the breathless excitement people describe when love arrives easily and openly. For an avoidant woman, falling in love often looks considerably more like a slow, guarded negotiation between genuine desire and genuine fear, a process that unfolds in distinct, recognizable stages, each one carrying its own particular texture and its own particular danger of being misread entirely. Today, we are walking through 7 of these stages, in order, so that if you are watching someone move through them right now, or if you recognize yourself within them, you finally have language for something that has likely felt confusing and difficult to name. The first stage typically involves what might be called cautious curiosity, a stage that looks, from the outside, almost like nothing significant is happening at all. During this stage, an avoidant woman notices genuine interest developing, but that interest gets filtered immediately through a kind of internal risk assessment, evaluating whether this particular person seems likely to demand more than she currently feels prepared to offer. This stage often includes considerable observation from a comfortable distance, genuine attentiveness paired with careful restraint, engagement that could easily be mistaken for simple friendliness, rather than the early stirring of something considerably more significant developing underneath. Let's talk about what makes this first stage so easy to misread, because misunderstanding it often creates confusion that follows a relationship well into its later development. Cautious curiosity does not announce itself through obvious romantic signaling, the way it might for someone with a more secure attachment style. It shows up instead through subtler cues, remembering small details from earlier conversations, gravitating toward proximity without direct pursuit, asking questions that reveal genuine interest while maintaining enough emotional distance to retreat easily if the interest starts to feel too exposing. Recognizing this stage requires patience and attentiveness to these quieter signals, rather than waiting for more overt, more conventional expressions of romantic interest. The second stage involves what deserves to be called internal negotiation, a stage where the initial curiosity has solidified into genuine, undeniable attraction, but that attraction now requires active internal management in order to feel tolerable. This stage often involves considerable private deliberation, weighing the appeal of pursuing genuine connection against the deeply ingrained belief that closeness eventually produces disappointment or loss of self. This internal negotiation can persist for considerable time, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, playing out entirely within her own private thoughts, long before any of it becomes visible externally. Let's talk about what this negotiation typically sounds like internally, because understanding its content clarifies why the resulting behavior often appears so genuinely inconsistent. This internal dialogue often oscillates between genuine hope, wondering whether this particular connection might prove different from earlier disappointments, and genuine dread, anticipating the eventual vulnerability and eventual potential hurt that deeper involvement would require. This oscillation frequently produces exactly the mixed signals so many people find confusing when navigating early connection with an avoidant woman: warmth followed by sudden withdrawal, followed by renewed warmth. A pattern reflecting genuine internal conflict rather than deliberate manipulation or genuine lack of interest. The third stage involves testing, a stage where the internal negotiation begins extending outward into actual behavior, deliberately or semi-consciously creating small moments of friction or distance in order to observe how the other person responds. This testing rarely occurs through conscious, calculated strategy. It emerges instead from deep protective instinct, an attempt to gather information about whether this particular person will react to distance with anxious pursuit, with anger, or with steady, patient consistency. Information that significantly shapes whether continued vulnerability feels safe enough to pursue further. Let's talk about what this testing typically looks like in practice, because recognizing it clearly helps prevent misinterpreting deliberate provocation, where genuine, unconscious information gathering is actually occurring instead. This might include creating small delays in response time, watching whether patience or anxiety follows. It might include mentioning other commitments or other priorities, watching whether jealousy or genuine, secure trust emerges in response. It might include occasional emotional distance, immediately following a particularly warm or vulnerable exchange, watching whether the other person interprets this distance charitably or reacts with immediate panic and immediate pursuit. The fourth stage involves what might be called selective opening, a stage where sufficient positive information has accumulated through the previous testing to allow genuine vulnerability to begin emerging, though this opening tends to happen carefully, incrementally, rather than all at once. During this stage, an avoidant woman typically begins sharing small pieces of her genuine internal experience, a difficult memory, a genuine fear, an honest reflection about her own patterns, offered tentatively and often watched closely afterward for how that vulnerability gets received and handled. Let's talk about why this selective opening deserves particular gentleness and particular patience from anyone witnessing it, because how this stage gets handled significantly influences whether continued opening feels safe enough to proceed further. Vulnerability offered during this stage, however small it might seem, represents genuine risk from her perspective, risk that took considerable internal courage to extend. Meeting this vulnerability with excessive excitement, excessive pressure for more disclosure, or any hint of judgment tends to trigger immediate retreat back toward the guardedness characteristic of earlier stages, sometimes considerably more entrenched than before the opening occurred at all. The fifth stage involves genuine attachment forming, a stage where the earlier ambivalence begins genuinely resolving in favor of real, undeniable emotional investment, even though this investment still frequently coexists with residual fear and residual defensive patterns. This stage often includes a noticeable shift in how she discusses the relationship, both internally and with trusted friends, moving from cautious hedging toward more genuine acknowledgement that this particular connection has become meaningful in ways she may have initially resisted admitting, even to herself. Let's talk about the specific complexity of this stage, because genuine attachment forming does not eliminate avoidant patterns entirely, creating a confusing period where real love and real defensive withdrawal continue operating simultaneously, rather than one simply replacing the other. She might express genuine care and genuine future-oriented thinking during one interaction, only to pull back noticeably during the next, not because the genuine attachment has disappeared, but because the very depth of that attachment activates renewed fear proportional to how significant the connection has genuinely become. The sixth stage involves what deserves to be called the crisis point, a stage that many avoidant women's relationships eventually reach, where the accumulated weight of genuine attachment collides directly with the deepest layer of avoidant fear, producing either significant breakthrough or significant retreat. This stage often coincides with some marker of increasing commitment or increasing permanence, a conversation about the relationship's future, an introduction to important people in each other's lives, any development that makes the relationship's significance impossible to continue minimizing or compartmentalizing. Let's talk about what determines whether this crisis point produces breakthrough or retreat, because this distinction matters enormously for understanding what typically happens next. Breakthrough tends to occur when sufficient safety has been established throughout the preceding stages, when testing consistently revealed patient, steady response rather than anxious pursuit or punishing reaction, when selective opening was consistently met with gentleness rather than pressure. Retreat tends to occur when this safety remains insufficiently established, when the accumulated evidence still leaves genuine doubt about whether the relationship can tolerate the vulnerability that deeper commitment would require. The seventh and final stage involves genuine, sustained integration, a stage reached only by relationships that successfully navigated the crisis point toward breakthrough rather than retreat. This stage involves love that has moved beyond the earlier ambivalence into something considerably more settled. Avoidant patterns still present, since these patterns rarely disappear entirely, but managed with considerably greater self-awareness and considerably greater willingness to communicate directly, rather than relying purely on withdrawal as the primary coping mechanism. Let's talk about what this final stage actually looks like in practice, because integration does not mean the complete disappearance of avoidant tendencies, a common and unrealistic expectation many people hold when hoping for this particular outcome. It means those tendencies becoming considerably less disruptive. Moments of needing space getting communicated directly rather than enacted through sudden silence. Difficult emotions getting shared with increasing, if still imperfect, openness. Genuine trust developing that closeness can exist without inevitably requiring the loss of self she may have feared throughout earlier stages of her own development. Let's talk about what it means to recognize these 7 stages within your own current situation. Recognition that offers considerable practical value, regardless of which particular stage currently describes what you are witnessing. Understanding that testing behavior reflects unconscious information gathering rather than deliberate manipulation allows for more patient, more accurate response. Understanding that selective opening requires gentleness rather than pressure protects against inadvertently triggering retreat during a genuinely fragile, genuinely important developmental moment. Understanding that the crisis point represents a genuine fork in the road, rather than simply confusing, inexplicable behavior, allows for more informed navigation of what is often the most difficult period any relationship with significant avoidant patterns eventually encounters. Let's talk about what patience throughout this entire 7-stage process actually requires. Patience considerably more demanding than simply waiting passively for eventual resolution. This patience involves consistent, steady presence throughout testing, without either anxious pursuit or defensive withdrawal in response. It involves gentle, non-pressuring reception of selective vulnerability whenever it appears. It involves clear, honest communication of your own needs throughout every stage, ensuring that patience never collapses into complete self-erasure simply in service of accommodating her own gradual process. Let's talk about what boundaries specifically look like throughout this entire developmental sequence, because patience and boundaries are not contradictory, despite how they might initially seem to conflict. Genuine boundaries might involve clearly communicating that while you understand and respect her need for gradual opening, you also require some evidence of forward movement over reasonable time, rather than accepting indefinite repetition of early stage testing without any genuine progression toward deeper stages ever occurring. This balance, patient but bounded, represents the healthiest possible navigation of this entire process from your own side of the relationship. Let's talk about what happens specifically if a relationship becomes genuinely stuck within one of these earlier stages, never progressing further despite considerable time having passed. This outcome deserves honest acknowledgement, rather than continued hopeful waiting extended indefinitely without corresponding evidence of genuine movement. Some relationships, despite genuine affection present within them, simply do not progress through this entire sequence, remaining permanently confined to testing or to minimal, incomplete selective opening, regardless of how much patience gets extended. Recognizing this possibility and honoring your own needs should this pattern become clear over meaningful time represents equally important wisdom alongside the patience discussed throughout this entire conversation. Let's talk about what genuine compassion for this entire process requires. Compassion extended both toward her, navigating these deeply rooted patterns, and toward yourself, navigating the genuine difficulty of loving someone moving through them. This compassion does not require excusing behavior that causes genuine, ongoing harm, but it does allow for accurate understanding that the confusing, sometimes painful behavior characteristic of these earlier stages reflects genuine internal struggle, rather than genuine indifference or genuine cruelty. Let's return briefly to the first stage, cautious curiosity, because it deserves additional texture worth understanding more fully. During this earliest stage, many avoidant women report a strange internal split, genuine excitement about a new connection paired simultaneously with an almost reflexive urge to minimize that excitement, even within their own private thoughts. This minimization often shows up as immediately generating reasons why the connection probably will not work out, focusing on incompatibilities or practical obstacles long before the relationship has developed enough to genuinely assess whether those obstacles matter. This preemptive minimization functions as a kind of emotional insurance, protecting against future disappointment by refusing to allow hope to develop too fully before any genuine investment has actually occurred. Let's talk more deeply about the second stage, internal negotiation, because this stage often involves specific recurring thoughts worth naming directly. Common internal refrains during this period include wondering whether she is capable of being what this particular person deserves, wondering whether pursuing the connection will eventually lead to disappointing someone she has come to care about, and wondering whether the safer choice involves simply not allowing the connection to deepen further at all. These thoughts, while painful, reflect genuine care rather than genuine disinterest, a paradox that often confuses partners who assume hesitation must indicate insufficient feeling, rather than recognizing it might indicate feeling that has become genuinely significant enough to trigger deep protective anxiety. Let's talk further about the third stage, testing, because this stage sometimes extends across a considerably longer period than people initially expect, sometimes persisting even after other stages have technically begun. This overlap occurs because testing rarely resolves completely and permanently after a single round of information gathering. New circumstances, increased stakes, or particularly vulnerable moments can reactivate testing behavior, even within relationships that have already progressed considerably further along this overall sequence. Meaning, occasional reappearance of testing patterns during later stages does not necessarily indicate regression, but may simply reflect renewed anxiety triggered by increased significance or increased stakes within the relationship's continued development. Let's talk more about the fourth stage, selective opening, exploring specifically what tends to happen when this vulnerability gets received poorly rather than well. If early attempts at selective opening get met with dismissiveness, with excessive reaction, or with any form of judgment, this stage often does not simply pause temporarily. It frequently retreats considerably, sometimes reactivating even more intense testing behavior as a kind of corrective measure, an attempt to more thoroughly vet whether continued vulnerability might prove safe before risking further exposure. This explains why early responses to selective opening carry such disproportionate weight in determining the relationship's overall trajectory, since mishandling this delicate stage can meaningfully delay or even prevent the relationship's progression toward the later stages entirely. Let's talk further about the fifth stage, genuine attachment forming, addressing a common source of confusion many partners experience during this particular period. The coexistence of genuine attachment alongside continued defensive behavior often gets misread as evidence that the attachment itself is not genuine, when in reality, this coexistence represents the normal, expected texture of this specific developmental stage, rather than contradictory evidence undermining the reality of her feelings. Learning to hold both truths simultaneously, genuine love developing alongside genuine ongoing fear, protects against the common mistake of dismissing real attachment simply because it continues to be accompanied by residual avoidant behavior. Let's talk more extensively about the sixth stage, the crisis point, because this stage deserves particularly careful examination given how significantly it shapes the relationship's ultimate trajectory. This crisis often does not announce itself clearly in advance, arriving instead somewhat suddenly once a specific triggering circumstance forces confrontation with the relationship's genuine significance. Common triggers include discussions about moving in together, discussions about long-term commitment, encountering genuine external threat to the relationship, such as a serious disagreement or a period of significant distance, any circumstance that makes continued minimization or continued compartmentalization of the relationship's importance no longer psychologically sustainable. Let's talk about what specific behavior during this crisis point tends to predict eventual breakthrough versus eventual retreat, behavior worth watching for carefully during this particularly significant period. Movement toward breakthrough often includes, even amid visible distress, some willingness to remain in difficult conversation, rather than disappearing entirely. Some acknowledgement, however imperfect, of what is actually happening internally. Movement toward retreat often includes complete disappearance, extended silence, considerably longer than her typical pattern, or sudden dramatic minimization of the relationship's significance entirely, an attempt to retroactively convince herself and her partner that the stakes were never as high as they had actually become. Let's talk more fully about the seventh stage, genuine integration, addressing what ongoing maintenance this stage actually requires, even once it has been reached. Integration does not represent a permanent, static achievement immune to future challenge. It requires continued, ongoing practice, particularly during moments of significant stress or significant life transition, when earlier avoidant patterns sometimes resurface, temporarily, even within relationships that have otherwise achieved considerable stability and considerable security. Recognizing this potential for temporary resurgence, without treating it as evidence that integration never genuinely occurred, supports continued healthy navigation, even during these more difficult, more challenging periods. Let's talk about what role a partner's own emotional regulation plays throughout this entire seven-stage journey, because this factor influences the relationship's trajectory just as significantly as anything occurring within the avoidant woman's own internal process. A partner capable of remaining steady throughout testing, gentle throughout selective opening, and patient throughout the uncertainty of the crisis point provides exactly the kind of consistent, reliable presence that supports movement toward breakthrough rather than retreat. A partner whose own anxiety or whose own reactivity intensifies throughout these stages, understandably, given how genuinely difficult this process can prove to navigate, may inadvertently reinforce exactly the fears driving the avoidant patterns in the first place. Let's talk about what self-compassion looks like for anyone recognizing themselves as the avoidant woman, moving through this particular seven-stage process, because this discussion has largely focused on how to understand and support someone navigating these stages. But genuine self-understanding matters equally for anyone recognizing their own patterns within this framework. If you recognize your own tendency toward cautious curiosity, toward internal negotiation, toward testing behavior you may not have fully understood as testing until encountering this description, extending genuine compassion toward yourself for these patterns, rather than harsh self-criticism, supports healthier navigation of your own continued growth throughout this process. Let's talk about what specific self-awareness practices might help someone move through these stages with greater intentionality, rather than purely automatic, unconscious reaction. This might involve noticing in real time when testing behavior begins occurring, pausing to ask honestly whether a particular action reflects genuine need or reflects unconscious information gathering that could instead be replaced with more direct communication. It might involve deliberately practicing selective opening, even when the urge to retreat feels strong, choosing consciously to remain present through initial vulnerability, rather than automatically withdrawing the moment exposure begins to feel uncomfortable. Let's talk about what professional support can specifically offer someone working to navigate these seven stages more consciously. Support considerably valuable given how deeply rooted these particular patterns typically prove to be. Therapeutic work focused specifically on attachment can help identify exactly where these patterns originated, providing genuine insight that supports more effective self-awareness than self-reflection alone often manages to achieve. This support does not eliminate the seven stages entirely, but it can help someone move through them with greater consciousness, potentially reducing the intensity or the duration of stages like testing or the crisis point that often prove most disruptive to relationships, lacking this kind of guided self-understanding. Let's talk about what it means to communicate this entire framework directly with a partner, should an avoidant woman choose to share this understanding, rather than allowing her partner to navigate these stages purely through external observation alone. Direct communication, something like naming that she recognizes her own tendency toward testing or toward selective, cautious opening, offers her partner considerably more accurate information than continued guesswork, while also demonstrating exactly the kind of self-awareness and direct communication that supports movement toward the later, more integrated stages of this entire process. Let's talk about what happens specifically when both partners within a relationship possess genuine understanding of this seven-stage framework. Understanding shared openly rather than held privately by only one person navigating it alone. This shared understanding often accelerates healthy progression through the more difficult stages, since both people can name what is happening in real time, rather than relying entirely on interpretation or guesswork. A partner who recognizes testing behavior for what it is, rather than reacting defensively or anxiously, provides exactly the kind of steady, informed response that supports movement toward eventual breakthrough at the crisis point. Let's talk finally about what genuine hope looks like throughout this entire seven-stage journey. Hope grounded not in denial of how genuinely difficult this process can prove, but in the well documented reality that avoidant patterns, however deeply rooted, remain genuinely capable of evolving toward greater security, given sufficient time, sufficient safety, and sufficient consistent effort from everyone involved. The seven stages described throughout this discussion do not represent a fixed, unchangeable fate. They represent a common, recognizable pattern, one capable of resolving toward genuine, sustainable intimacy when navigated with patience, with honesty, and with genuine mutual commitment to understanding, rather than judging whatever difficulty this particular journey inevitably requires. Let's talk about what timeline realistically applies across these seven stages, because expectations here deserve grounding in genuine reality, rather than in unrealistic hope for rapid progression. Some relationships move through these stages within a matter of months, particularly when both partners bring considerable self-awareness and considerable patience to the process. Others require years, particularly when earlier attachment wounds run especially deep, or when external circumstances add additional stress to an already delicate developmental process. Neither timeline is inherently more correct, and comparing your own specific situation against some assumed universal standard often produces unnecessary discouragement, rather than genuine, useful insight into your own particular circumstances. Let's talk about what it means to hold this entire framework as a useful map rather than a rigid, mandatory script that every relationship must follow identically. Some relationships move through these seven stages in slightly different order. Some skip certain stages briefly before circling back to them later. Some experience several stages simultaneously, rather than in the cleanly sequential progression this discussion has described for the sake of clarity. Trusting your own specific observation of your own specific situation, informed by this broader framework, but never governed rigidly by it, represents the most accurate, most useful application of everything discussed throughout this entire conversation. Let's talk about a specific detail worth adding to the discussion of cautious curiosity. The way this earliest stage often includes a distinctive kind of watchfulness, extended not just toward the other person's words, but toward their consistency across different contexts and different moods. An avoidant woman moving through this stage frequently observes how someone treats service workers, how they handle minor frustrations, how they speak about previous relationships, gathering a broader picture of character that extends well beyond the immediate romantic interaction itself. This watchfulness is not suspicion in a hostile sense. It reflects a genuine, careful desire to gather accurate information before allowing herself to invest emotionally in someone whose character remains, at this early stage, still largely unknown.